Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plot Lines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're talking to Dr. Gerry Crete, who is the author of a new book, Litanies of the Heart, Relieving Post-Traumatic Stress and Calming Anxiety Through Healing Our Parts. And I get the pleasure of talking to him today. So thank you, Dr. Crete, for coming on the show. I'm very happy to talk to you.
Yeah, great to be here.
You've been on Pints with Aquinas many a time, so I bet a lot of people are familiar with you. But if they're not, could you give a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. I'm originally from Canada, and did a history degree, actually, my original undergrad, and so I love history, and with a minor in English, so I love literature. But I moved to the United States way back, and worked as a school counselor for a while, and then eventually completed a doctorate and have been doing marriage and family therapy work for a number of years now and starting my own practice. But I'm really like keen on this whole area of like integrating our Catholic faith with sound and good mental health treatment, because I feel like it's the whole person. We're working with the whole person when we're identifying, mental, spiritual, and physical, and we're addressing all of them. So yeah, so my book was an effort to bring together lots of my clinical experience, the different kinds of treatments that I have used in working with people with trauma, people with anxiety issues, and but also the spiritual element as well.
That's great. I think people are very hesitant about getting help, especially with a lot of what I see as sort of madness in psychiatry and stuff like that. So would and your form of counseling, like how do people go about pursuing that? Obviously this book will be a great start for people, but where professionally do people look?
Well, yeah. I mean, in my case, I have a private practice, and we're a group of like 11 counselors and coaches, and they're all Catholic. And so, it's Transfiguration Counseling and Coaching is the name of our program. And the therapists are good at, working through different traumas and issues like depression and anxiety. And the coaches are great at helping people to flourish or helping them make transitions and helping them move forward with their lives. So I think so you could find a practice like ours that is identifies as faith-based, and there's more and more of them across the country. So you can go to catholictherapist.com and you could find Catholic therapists there. There's also the Catholic Psychotherapy Association, which has a directory of people. So yeah, there's more and more resources where that the therapist you're seeing is not going to argue with your faith perspective. They're not going to push you towards something like that you would be going against your faith. Like they're never going to say like, maybe you should consider an abortion, or maybe you should consider, why don't you just divorce the person? Like they're never going to do that.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's comforting for people, or they're never going to like put down your faith or act like there's something wrong with it. But at the same time, there are licensed professionals who are good at what they do in terms of the actual counseling skills. So it's a wonderful marriage.
Beautiful. And you've brought this all your knowledge into this book. The reading your book, this was the first time I ever heard of sort of the parts, like how are would it be the brain? Is that the right the or the mind or subconscious? Sort of is broken up into parts. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, what I would say is that I would say our mind, but I would say our mind and heart, I guess. Um, and it's that into our interior life, and maybe if you could say our personality is made up of different parts. And sometimes, even in the psychological world, we've kind of had this idea of like our personality is one thing, and but that's just not even true ever. Like we're never one thing 24/7. We have we even speak this way, like we say, oh, there's a part of me that hates this, person. There's another part of me that really appreciates them. Like we talk about, like there's a part of me that wants to, go work out, and then there's another part of me that wants to like, oh my gosh, I just want to do nothing, right? So we have inner conflicts within us all the time, and we have parts that show up that are really functional in life, right? Related sometimes to jobs, related to relationships. But we also have parts that show up that are that it can be self-destructive, right? And we have parts, that are wounded and that are we keep very far away from our regular conscious mind for various reasons. These are parts that have been traumatized, or they're holding the trauma. So we're all one person, but our personality is complex. And this parts approach really helps to work with the whole personality to bring ourselves into a unity while we're still respecting our amazing different skills, talents, and resources of our parts. So when I was learning about this method, and I was starting to use it with clients, it was like amazing how well it worked and how quickly people were experiencing healing. But it did actually cause me to ask the very question you're asking, is like, so what does it mean, like, that we have parts? Like, I want to understand. My little philosopher brain was like trying to figure that out. And the other question I had was, is this consistent with our faith? Like, what does our faith say about this? And that took me into like exploring the Old Testament, the New Testament, St. Paul talking about, I do what I do not want to do. You have St. James talking about his members at war with each other. You got, then in the history of the church, you've got St. Augustine saying, my disintegrated heart. There's a lot of language, and it's interesting to see that there's actually a strong tradition within the church and within the Bible and the church for an idea that our personalities are actually multiple. So
That's really quite interesting. And you're familiar with the temperaments, right?
yes, yeah,
How does this mix with temperaments, or how does this relate to like the four temperaments?
yeah. And you're referring to choleric, sanguine, melancholic.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. I always resisted those four temperaments for a long time.
Okay.
And not like I came to terms with it, but I had an immediate, years ago, like we're talking 15 years ago or something, I had an immediate aversion. I was pretty familiar with Myers-Briggs, where, I don't know, it's also a temperament based thing, but it's, the letters. So you're an INFJ or an INTP or something. And I
Mm.
was familiar with that system. What I liked about that system was it seemed like it was just generally positive, like there was no wrong type. But when I looked at the temperaments, I always felt like they were all kind of awful, right? Like choleric were right. Yeah, cholerics are like angry and stuff, and sanguines are like flighty, and melancholics are always just kind of downers, and phlegmatics just don't do anything, right? And so it took me a long time. Like I'm going, okay, I see that it makes some kind of sense. Like there are people who have a dominance in one area or another that you could point to. So I see the usefulness when you recognize, oh, this person is dominantly choleric and they're married to somebody who is dominantly phlegmatic, and this is why they're struggling, right? Because she's always angry and wanting to do things and be energetic, and he seems to never move, right? Stuff like that. So, but and so to marry that to a concept of parts is a little tricky, because it's sort of on a different axis. But I would say we have, all of us, a part that is choleric, a part that is sanguine, a part that is phlegmatic, a part that is melancholic, and that on some level, we one of those parts is more dominant than other parts in our system. So that's the one that we're kind of using all the time. And so sometimes you're like, well, you got to appreciate that. But other times it's like, well, would there be a better balance if all four, let's say you have four parts like that, were actually in greater harmony and working well together? Would you be a whole person? Would you be more Christ-like? Because one could argue that Christ was that perfect balance of those four temperaments, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think I've heard a few priests talk about that Christ had. I can't remember if it was like he had 100% all of them, or it was all, or it's just evenly divided or something like that. I can't remember what it was exactly, but it was definitely a mixture of all of them. Um,
Well, people have asked also, like, to me, when it comes to parts work, did Christ have parts? And my answer is yes. I believe he did, because he was fully human, and it's a reality of being human that you have parts. And so the difference would be that Christ's parts were in perfect harmony. Our parts often fight with each other. and, and our parts are carrying sometimes burdens, heavy burdens of shame, or heavy burdens of fear or pain and grief and loss. And and then we're managing all that in sometimes unhealthy ways. And so our inner system can look very messy and look very and disorienting, whatever, disorganized. Whereas Christ's parts were in perfect harmony. But he calls us, I think, he calls us, in terms of to heal, and he calls us. He says that the kingdom of God is within. He says that in Luke. So yes, there's the kingdom of God that's around us, and we can look forward to. But he says there's a kingdom of God within. So if the kingdom of God is within, then our parts are all working in this kingdom in a beautiful, harmonious way, with a benign king, a good king, and all the subjects are just doing what they're supposed to do, and it feels good, and the whole system works well, right? And that's kind of I think that's what he's calling us to.
yeah, that's beautiful. Now, with your love of literature, it one of the biggest examples of like parts, sticking out to me, is Bilbo in the beginning of The Hobbit, with his Tookish side and his Baggins side, um, sort of going head to head over what he's going to do. What do you think about Tolkien's sort of possible use of parts in that?
Yeah. You know that once you bring up Tolkien, we'll be talking about that the rest of the time, right?
That that's all right. How
Yeah, I like that. Actually, I hadn't quite thought of Bilbo and the Tookish side and the Baggins side, but that makes a lot of sense. That he was so thoroughly a Baggins, a comfortable Baggins at the beginning, and some other part inspired him to get up and leave that morning. He almost didn't, but he listened to one part of him. So I like that. The Tookish part basically said, "No, you're going to miss out, or you've got to go," and he goes running out, right? And so I
Mhm.
love that. And in fact, his journey, right, like any hero's journey, is about discovering one's parts, especially parts of the self that didn't we never actualized very much, right? So Bilbo learns a lot of bravery. He learns a lot of, like, he has to be courageous. He also learns, you know um his integrity. Like, he learns about what it means to sacrifice even for the greater good. Like when he chooses the whole thing with Oakenstone, or whatever, the Thorin's
Oakenshield.
Oakenshield. Thank you. It's been a while.
Yeah.
And he chooses, defies Thorin, but he does that, for this greater good. I mean, look at the nobility of that, and the self. And he didn't mind that he could be killed for that, and he was willing to do that. That's a radically different Bilbo than we saw at the very beginning, right? So lots of parts of Bilbo were allowed to emerge in that process. So I love it. Um,
Yeah, it's crazy, and he does it. He battles those two sides, or two parts, throughout the entire book. So it's not like it's not like the Baggins, the comfortable side, goes away. It comes up when he's feeling cold, or when there's not much food around or something like that. He sort of wants to not be. He wants to not have chosen the path he chose.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating. Another thing that's just occurring to me, is the ring, and the ring is such an amazing, right, metaphor for all sorts of things. But when he gets so Bilbo discovers the ring, and it saves him. It saves him from being eaten by Gollum. It saves him on multiple occasions with the spiders and with the wood elves and on and on. And so it was a good for him, but we learn right later that the ring, in fact, has an evil presence. So the ring can take you over, and consume you, and try to rule through you, and all this. So we find that out, of course, in the Lord of the Rings. But I think that's interesting because our parts are good intentioned, and there's a specific type of part. We sometimes call it a firefighter part because it kind of comes in to save us when there's something, when the system's overwhelmed by some strong emotion. But it doesn't, like a fireman, it doesn't really care like about your house. Like it doesn't care about your windows or your carpets. It just goes in and puts out the fire. So there can be a destruction that comes afterward. Well, but if you think about a firefighter part as being like, sometimes comes in and like, I'm going to stop the pain by binge drinking alcohol or doing drugs, or I'm just going to stop the pain by isolating from everybody, or playing video games for 20 hours, or pick a thing, right? It's like whatever it is, and it works, and it will stop the pain. It will in some ways help you cope. And so the ring worked for Bilbo. So for that whole book, the ring saves him. He uses it. He copes with he uses it to cope. And we use lots of things to cope. And sometimes the things are in and of themselves, they're neutral, but sometimes they're just helpful. But when we overuse, right, or or they become the way that we just cope with life all the time, then it consumes us, like we see what happens in Lord of the Rings, and what could happen to Frodo, but what did happen to Gollum, right? It by over dependence on it, it changes you into being something that you don't even recognize. So I just
It's interesting that it is a coping mechanism, and it really is in that sense that without it, Frodo feels like empty, uh,
Mhm.
or at least he feels unprotected, or and the movies does this very a lot. When in the movies, if Bilbo doesn't know where the ring is, he freaks out, and wants to find it. I can't
Right.
remember if that's exactly true in the book, um, that adds to sort of the coping mechanism aspect of it. And also, I mean, there's something crazy also going on with Gollum and Smeagol as well. I don't
Mhm.
know if is that. Do you think that would be like full blown multiple personality disorder? I would assume, or is that something else?
I mean, I don't know that it would be necessarily has to look at it as DID, like multiple personality, only because I think Smeagol and Gollum know about each other, and they almost go back and forth between each other and speak. In most of the time in DID, you have a part that there's amnesia to what that part is doing, so you don't even
Hmm.
remember. Like, it's a pretty extreme, right? It's a pretty extreme disorder on this continuum. And most people, when I'm talking to them about parts, they're like, does this mean I have like multiple personality disorder? I'm like, no, we all have parts. But if it's DID, then you may have parts that are actually not aware of other parts. So you've compartmentalized your system so much that if a part is like in charge, so to speak, or in the executive for 3 hours doing things that, and then you don't even remember what you were doing for those like so that's such an extreme. So I don't even know that that was true for Smeagol and Gollum. Now, we didn't I'm remembering more of the movie. I'd have to go back and look at the books because I've read them like 5 times, but it's been a while.
Hmm.
But and sometimes you see the movie more often, and then it all blurs. But
Yeah,
at
I
least,
agree.
yeah, at least in the movie, it does seem like whoa, this is the first time we're realizing the double dimension to Gollum, and he literally has an inner conflict that he plays out. Do I am I nice to the hobbits? Am I not nice? Do I kill them? Do I not? And and then he makes a choice. So that really is that inner conflict that we see all the time with our parts, and we end up making some kind of choice. And sometimes it seems like we're making the good choice, like he's very cooperative. But also, what's brilliant in Lord of the Rings is that it's his trauma that causes it to be even worse. So, like, Gollum is tortured, right? He's tortured originally and by the Dark Lord, and then later when he is captured by Faramir, and by his guards, he's like, it triggers his trauma. So he
If I'm
now,
not mistaken, just for all the book movie people, if I'm not mistaken, that's I think mainly movie thing.
okay,
Uh, but I could be wrong about that too. I just remember that Faramir was made more like, not as nice of a guy in the beginning, but he is in the book, I think.
oh,
Anyways, but yes, continue with what you're saying.
yeah, and again, it's been a while. I have to look, but the fact is, the interesting thing, at least in the movie, is that you have Gollum being triggered by his trauma, which then tips him right over the edge of the dark side of the dark part, whatever the Gollum part, taking over completely. He will never trust the hobbits now, right? And that was triggered by trauma, which is kind of cool to me because that's what my book is about, is like dealing with post-traumatic stress and how we understand our traumas and why we make choices that we do sometimes. So yeah, Gollum is just, to see Gollum playing out in a movie is like watching parts where it come alive. Like, that is so amazing.
He needed your book.
Yeah. Well, yeah. He
Uh,
didn't. Tolkien was already brilliant. He understood the human person so well.
no, Gollum did.
Oh, Gollum. Oh, yes. Thank
It's
you.
me.
Yes,
Yeah, that he
definitely.
needed it to heal him, to help heal him. But also with the ring, uh Gollum also hates the ring, but also it basically put himself, or put the ring above everything else as well at the same time.
Yeah. No, that's true. Um,
Is there a sort of a element of parts in there? Does that make
well,
sense for parts?
I see the ring as the burden. So the burden is that it is something that, on one hand, you want desperately and compulsively, and the other hand, it actually is destroying you. And so you have parts that recognize that it's destroying you, and you have other parts that desperately want it and will do anything for it. So that creates this dilemma. And I think if you look at, say, if you looked at the Lord of the Rings as like a macrocosm of the inner person, so then we all have an inner Aragorn, we all have an inner Gandalf, we all have an inner Frodo and an inner Sam and an inner Pippin and whatnot. And so if that's the case, then we have a part, or an inner Gollum. So we have a part, the inner Gollum part is going to be like, you know, he just wants, he's just going after what he wants no matter what, and he could kill the rest of the system for it, kind of, if he's stays burdened. But we have, like, between, like, you see Frodo and Sam, like Frodo is the part that is sort of noble and obviously wants to do the right thing, but he's also sort of weak, and at certain points, physically weak at least and stuff. And so in the end, he fails morally at the very end. He doesn't do, he is vulnerable to the ring, and at the very end he almost, right. But look at the part that's Sam. Like, we have parts that are helper parts, that are self-sacrificing, that are loyal, that are noble, and this kind of thing. So we see Sam carrying Frodo sometimes. So we recognize in that model, like, our our parts are needed to help and support each other. Our inner system is designed to help itself. And I would argue, maybe, I don't know, I have to think about this a little bit, but I would almost argue that Aragorn is a little bit like the core self. And why I say that is a little bit, you have to stretch the analogy a bit, it can be tricky, but but he's a little bit like that because when we meet him as Strider, he doesn't know who he is, right? We're wondering who he is and this kind of thing. It takes us a while to realize he's actually the king.
Mhm.
He's actually the king, and it takes him a long time to actually take the role of king. And once he does, I mean, man, he's able to accomplish so much, right? And he turns everything around. But he has to own who he is, and I think that's true of our inmost self. I think in general, our inmost self is kind of clouded over, maybe with sin or whatnot, by other parts that are dysregulated, that are kind of taken over, if you will. They're sort of, I think of it like an eclipse, like if the inmost self is the sun, and you've got parts that kind of eclipse the sun. It's there, it's not getting much light through. But so that's the same. Strider is like eclipsing that sun. And once he's revealed, I mean, that's who we are. And we are, in a way, like I would say that our inner core represents both our inner king, our inner prophet, our inner priest, right? And
Mhm.
so we have, I don't know if you would call, I'm just speculating now, so I may change my mind, but I'm thinking on the fly that Aragorn is like that inner king, Gandalf is like the inner priest. Who would
I
be
think it's usually prophet.
prophet?
Uh,
Okay, and who would be the inner priest? I don't know
I
if that
think
fits it.
Frodo is because he does the sacrifice part.
Oh,
I think
okay.
that's how it usually goes.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. No, that's cool to me. And so, yeah, so those parts all kind of represent it. They could represent at different times apart, but they could also represent the inner self. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, it also if you were, sort of dealing with that burden, that of the ring, like, what would be sort of the mentality you'd go through with the person dealing
Mhm.
with that burden that they at some point they desperately desire, but they also hate?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a bunch of things. It depends. Sometimes we have manager parts that are carrying burdens, right? And sometimes it's those exiles, those wounded parts. So usually the burdens often represent some kind of lie or some kind of negative belief, or they represent some strong emotion that's attached to that. Well, it would be both, I guess. So if you have a part that, let's say it's a manager part, and they believe that, and they're constantly working, and so you're kind of a workaholic, nothing's good enough, you're always doing the next thing, you never take a break, you rarely rest, you don't take vacations, you work, 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 work. That's an overburdened manager part. Well, if you pause, and in this process, in this treatment, you get to know that part. You start off by thanking the part for working so hard. You kind of develop some kind of relationship with this part of yourself, and so that the part starts to trust you and feels your presence and knows that you actually, you intend good things. But then you probe a little bit. What are you afraid of? If you let, like, well, you might want to figure out what that burden is. So the burden is probably, if I don't work, I am worthless, or I'm not. If I don't do enough, if I'm not perfect, I'll be seen as incompetent or something. Well, then what are you? So if you're asking the question, like, what are you afraid of if you put that burden down? Well, it will reveal like something like, yeah, like I'll be seen as incompetent, and I'll be ridiculed, or somebody will say I'm worthless. When did you learn that? When did you learn that if you don't work all the time, that you're worthless? And then suddenly the part is now telling you its story. You start to figure out, okay, what is the story of this part? Maybe it might seem funny to the person because they often, it's things like, yeah, when I was in third grade and Mrs. Anderson said this to me, and now, and I learned, or the other kids in class called me something, and then might go back to that far back when you're that little, and it's like, oh, okay, so you learned. No wonder you're overworking all the time. No wonder you're this way. You've been told your whole childhood that you weren't good enough or you didn't do enough. Okay, what if we could let go of this burden, and you could discover that you are good enough, or that you are lovable or worthwhile, or whatever the thing is? And would that be something you're interested in? So you're literally communicating with this part. And usually the parts are going to be like, yeah. Sometimes they'll be like, yeah, but I don't believe it. That would be nice, but I doubt it can happen. I'd say, of course you doubt it. You've been spent your whole life believing this. You're not going to suddenly not doubt it, but would you be willing to try it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes right now? So this is a very experiential thing. And if the person puts down the burden, and then you're like, and then you're wanting to see, what did this kid need? So like back in third grade with Mrs. Anderson, now that if you're talking to the person, like now you're an adult, what would adult you want to say to third grade you that Mrs. Anderson should have said, but she didn't? Her mom should have said, or dad should have said when you got home, but they didn't. What does this part need? And then usually, unless there's another part interfering that you check for, but usually if it's coming from self, it'll be like, you don't have to work so hard. You are precious as you are. You do good things, and that's good enough. And whatever it is, so whatever they needed to hear, like, you're always precious. You're always important. You are loved, whatever. And so, but then you don't just say that. You're like, could the part take that in? Can the part actually soak in? I am good enough the way I am. I don't have to prove myself, right? I can do good works because they're simply good and I'm good at them, but I'm not doing them because I think I'm worthless. Can that sink in? So and then you go to the part, would you like, after they feel that, you want them to actually experience it, right? What's it like feeling this way? Usually the part, if they're a child part, like a third grade part, they're like, I want to play with my Star Wars action figures. So that would have been me. I want to do whatever. I want to jump around. And suddenly this childlike part is actually childlike again. And then you could say, listen, do you want to, okay, that burden we put down, do you want to pick it up again or not? And almost always once you get that point, they're like, no, okay, what do we want to do with that burden? And then there's a little process to get rid of it. And honestly, if the person was a Tolkien fan, I would suggest and say, do you want to throw that freaking thing into Mount Doom? And then when it goes into Mount Doom, just like in the movie, we're going to watch it. We're going to watch it deteriorate and into that fiery lava thing. And then, okay, what's it like now that that burden is gone? Relief. So that's a little bit of unburdening process there.
Okay. Yeah. And is there any concern with this type of process that could be that could overdo it, like sort of make it go the sort of the opposite way? So like if your problem is you work too hard or you're overworking yourself, is there a danger of it becoming not you no longer are working enough?
Right.
I,
I haven't found that to be the case. I think sometimes when the polarization, though, is between a part that wants to work all the time, that's usually a manager part, and then a firefighter part that wants to do nothing, right? Who's just going to binge watch TV all weekend, smoke weed, and not do anything. So if you have two parts like that, a workaholic and a totally checked out stoner part, then you kind of do have to work with both of those parts, right? Because if you and the what will often happen is when you ask the manager, what are you afraid of happening if you let go of this burden, the manager might literally say, I'm worried that stoner part is going to take over the system, because this is why I exist, is to make sure he doesn't. And so then you say, okay, if we worked with stoner part and we're able to help him, and he was not taking over the system, and he was, and all that, would that be okay? Would that help? Usually it's like, yes. So then we actually might need to turn our attention to this other part and actually figure out, okay, what are you, why are you checking out all the time, or what's going on with you, and understand this part. You find out stoner part has a really good intention, because his intention is typically, it's always going to be a bit different, but I'll make one up. His intention might be that if I don't sometimes take over, then that guy is going to work us to death and we're never going to have any fun. Oh, okay. So in your case, and it works, right? So for the weekend, we did nothing and I was able to stop him, right? Okay, so if he was able to relax and chill, still get his work done, and he wasn't overwhelming the system with no fun, would you be able to moderate your time and find health? Would you be open to having healthy ways to relax and finding healthy ways to have recreation and stuff like that that the whole system's okay with? Would you be open to that? And usually the part is going to say, yeah, if that happens, sure. And so basically there you're working with those two parts. And then eventually when they both kind of agree, because they're listening to each other, it sounds funny, you bring them to the table together and you're like, okay, how are we going to negotiate this? Right? Like, we want to have fun sometimes. He has a point. We do need to get our work done. He has a point, but it can't be all the time work and it can't be all the time fun. Can we work together? And then you actually get the parts working together. And the core self, the inmost self, is the one leading that facilitation, right? And so now you're getting trust from these parts, start to trust the self, who's now maybe for the first time truly present with them, and is going to have, like, is going to be fair about it and ultimately wanting the good of the whole system, right? And so we end up having a system that is actually functioning in a way toward the good. If I be a little Thomistic here, that we're working toward our proper end as a whole.
Gotcha. Awesome. And with the inner self, is that kind of like what God made us to be?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say the whole person is who God made us to be, all of the parts and everything. But
Okay.
I would say the whole person is in His image. But I would say that the innermost self best reflects that image of God.
Hmm.
And I kind of go to certain saints, like it's Saint Paul who calls it the inmost self. You have Saint Athanasius talking about the mirror of the soul. You have some other monks in that talking about the eye of the heart, or the cave of the heart. Or you get this all these different kind of language, or true self. Sometimes you'll see here. So you get this throughout Christianity, like these different notions. I think the biblical Old Testament term that is often fits quite well is the way they use heart in the Old Testament. But it really speaks to our deepest spiritual center. And I would say that that is the faculty, the deepest center is has the faculty to connect with God. And it's a vehicle, if you will, for the grace of God to work through the person to the whole system. So if you've eclipsed it, if you've blocked it off with sin or whatever, it's really not, this is the whole person not getting access to that grace. But when it's opened up, man, it's transformative. And I would say that the infused virtues, faith, hope, and love, are the ones that this inmost self is able to apprehend and offer to the rest of the system.
Interesting. Yeah, do people sometimes, when you first tell them about this, do they get a little bit like confused, or like this is kind of crazy? Like, is that kind of the response they get sometimes?
Sometimes, yeah, like people have our time. That's kind of why I wrote the book, was to
Mhm.
say, like, okay, this is solidly Catholic and it makes sense and it works, and here I'm going to show you how. It's funny. Do a lot of work with priests and religious and monks and stuff, and uh, and and with that population where they typically know about prayer, know about especially contemplative style prayer. Uh, One would hope, right?
Mhm.
They take to it like this. They get it right away. It's interesting. Whereas if someone isn't very self-aware and they're not very self-reflective, it's sometimes it's a lot of work to even get them to look inside. So when you say, "Hey, can you take a moment to look inside?" They look at you like there's something strange. What do you mean look inside? They don't even understand what that means. So with those people, you'd have to do a lot of little exercises to prepare them and to connect them with it, and make some sense of it. And that's where I do talk about, sometimes just inner conflicts, like what, and try to at least identify in them some inner conflict. When I had a tough case like that, and the guy was just not able to look inside or connect it with parts. But then something happened where he found a letter that he wrote in 8th grade. And at that time, there's like all kinds of stuff going on in his family. But he wrote like a journal entry, and he found his 8th grade letter. And it really revealed a lot about what he was going through at that time, which this guy had completely shut off. Right. And so when he read the letter and we looked at it, and I said, what would it be like to write back to the 8th grader? Right. And so he started a conversation with this 8th grade part of himself, but he needed the object, the 8th grade letter, to kind of like help him to kind of picture, oh, there's an 8th grade part of me that went through hell. And he got to hear this voice coming right out of the journal, and then he could connect with it by talking to it, and that opened the whole thing up.
Hmm, interesting. Is there sort of a way that the parts can, obviously it's very helpful for, like therapists and stuff like that, but is there a way that non-therapists can kind of help those that are around us who are struggling with different parts? Because you might see somebody who's, I don't know, you know, really bad with friendships or really bad with getting their work done, or that anything, any problem, whatever it is, um, or they're distant or something like that. Always, is there a way that you might suggest uh, non-therapists, uh, going
Yeah.
about helping people like with the parts?
Well, I'm hoping is that my book will help people do that, in a sense that it
Hmm.
will help them learn about their parts, connect with their parts, and therefore use it in their regular life, right? And but we also have like on soulsandhearts.com, which is a online resource for like blogs and podcasts and all this stuff. And it's a Catholic program of human formation, but it's grounded in internal family systems, which is the most popular parts work model. There's an online community called Resilient Catholics, and so if you join that online community, you will learn that it's a year long. Like there's the first part is a year long program of learning about your parts and learning about how. And you're in small groups, and you're going to immediately notice a difference in how you how you are with yourself, but and how you are with other people. Like it's pretty quickly transformative. Um, so and I'm working on a program right now to offer to spiritual directors and coaches as well as counselors, so that our pastoral associates or pastoral counselors, anybody that's doing helping work with others, could start to use this model. So that's coming.
Okay, awesome. That's great. So, uh, I mean, I this book you can find at Sophia Institute Press. I'll have a link in the description. I encourage everyone to go out and get it. It's very interesting. If you're like if you've I've been very interested in like the temperaments and stuff like that. But like if you're interested like me in those types of things, I think this additional aspect will be uh, sort of mind blowing in a different way. And you said it yourself, Dr. Crete, melding the two. That they can be melded, and that would you say that's a benefit to meld the two?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this model can incorporate a lot of things. I've been doing some work on Clifton strengths as a way of, it's a really interesting tool to understand your strengths, and based on a lot of research from Gallup. And I've been working with some coaches who do Clifton strengths to understand that our strengths are kind of our managers. We have managers that have those strengths. And so we want to, when we understand them better, we're just function better as a person. So yeah, things like strengths, things like there's Sherry Waddell's charisms, I think are interesting. There's the temperaments, there's the Greek temperaments, there's the Myers-Briggs temperament. I'm all about figuring out how they play together to learn about ourselves better and grow and heal. So yeah, I love melding. I'm an integrationist.
Okay, awesome. And we really live in a mental health crisis at the moment, but it really seems like the things that most people are doing to try and combat that are just completely ineffective, or uh, make it way, way worse.
Mhm. Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's just feeds itself, right? Like our, getting through COVID, for example, and a lot of isolation, a lot of it's had an impact on all of society. But even before that, we were already seeing high levels of anxiety and depression. So, and we cope with it. We have firefighters that cope with it in all sorts of negative ways. A rise in alcoholism, a rise in drug use, a rise in different kinds of domestic violence and things like that. So yeah, we definitely need tools. We definitely need ways to address our mental health issues for sure. So
And putting like your Catholic faith alongside the mental health aspect, I mean, you're not a psychiatrist, but I mean, psychiatry is supposed to be the study of the soul, if I'm not mistaken.
well, yeah, I mean, nowadays psychiatrists are medical doctors who hand out prescriptions mostly.
Well,
The
but the
word
word, right? The word
psyche,
means
yeah, the word psyche from psychology or psychiatry is is defined. Yeah, it's the soul. And so yeah, so the field of psychology should be the study of the soul, and we've disconnected, right, soul and body in a very gnostic way,
ex-
perhaps.
yeah,
uh,
that there's a lot of mental health areas where that is quite obvious that we've broken the soul away from the body. And if you don't treat the soul and the body together, you're not going to fix the problem. And this is uh, what you're doing is a part of that. So I just want to thank you for that.
no, my pleasure.
Uh, well, Dr. Crete, this has been a wonderful conversation. Everybody go out and get Dr. Crete's book. As I said, link will be in the description. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Anything to say before we go, Dr. Crete?
uh I'm tempted to say one ring to rule them all, but and
Nah.
in the darkness bind them, but maybe that's not what we want for our parts. We want them to be in freedom and harmony.
Well, last Lord of the Rings thing. Do you have a favorite character?
Ooh, that's so hard. Why do I have to pick? I think I've gone through different phases. I think when I was a kid, I loved Gandalf,
Okay.
and so he's stayed with me. But I love all of them for different
Okay.
reasons.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right.
And God bless everyone.